Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects, TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tricia Jedele, Offshore Wind Policy Manager for the Nature Conservancy. I coordinate TNC's offshore wind work to ensure that it can be used to meet our climate conservation and community goals. The world is racing to deploy 380 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And on the Atlantic coast here in the United States, we are on track to deploy over 50 gigawatts by 2040. Offshore wind is a complicated topic. We want to know why we are focusing so much on offshore wind, how it will help mitigate climate change. We want to know how much it costs and how it will impact the species and habitats we care about, what it means for jobs, our economies, and our communities. As this energy transition unfolds before our eyes, we know there are so many questions, and people are looking for clear, honest, and accurate information to help them answer these questions. TNC is launching this webinar series to create a space where once a month for the next 6 months, we can bring you content experts who can help us fill in some of the blanks on the most challenging aspects and questions we have about offshore wind. Today's topic is about how to understand the true value of offshore wind in terms of costs, reliability, public health, and the environment. We will be hearing from 2 content experts who will share the results of their recent reports that tell us why building offshore wind now will save New England money by 2030. We will dig in a little bit to see why we have to look at the bigger picture over time to understand the real cost of wind. The price point we see on an offshore wind contract today doesn't tell us the whole story or how valuable it actually is. Offshore wind in New England is a perfect example of how a smart investment now will save you much more in the long run. We can all understand and relate to how the price tag on, let's say, replacing your roof doesn't show you how much money you will actually save, because now you don't have to repaint a ceiling or replace a carpet because the roof leaked after a storm. There is value, in other words, and a savings above and beyond the price tag on a single investment. The last thing I'll say before I introduce our speakers is that while the applications of these reports are specific to New England, they demonstrate a reality about offshore wind that is playing out throughout the United States. There are multiple factors that have to be considered when we think about the true price tag of offshore wind. These reports that we are learning about today represent models of the types of analyses we can and maybe should be doing in other places where offshore wind is an important part of the energy future. Now to the presentations. Our first presentation is from Sierra Club and Synapse. Melissa Whited is the Vice President of Synapse Energy Economics. Melissa is an economist by training and has a background in environmental science. She specializes in issues related to utility regulation and rate design. As part of her work on this topic, Melissa served as the project manager and a lead author of the report called Charting the Wind, which quantifies the ratepayer, climate, and public health benefits of offshore wind in New England. Sarah Crame is a staff attorney with the Sierra Club Environmental Law Program. Her work focuses on the decarbonization of the energy system, transportation, and buildings in New England. She will provide some context for why the Sierra Club asked Synapse to prepare the report we'll be hearing about in a minute. Our second presenter, Susan Muller, is a senior energy analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She focuses on ISO New England, the regional energy system operator for New England, and the grid integration of offshore wind. She will be discussing the analysis that the Union of Concerned Scientists prepared to explain how offshore wind is important not only to the state's climate goals, but also how it will protect against the risk of winter blackouts. This analysis was submitted in June to the state of Maine in response to its request for information to help shape its new offshore wind renewable energy and economic development program. But it's also relevant to any New England state considering an investment in offshore wind. As you think of questions for Melissa, Sarah, and Susan, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please indicate whether the question is general or for a specific presenter. We will hear both presentations first before the Q&A portion of today's program. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Melissa and Sarah, I'll pass it on to you to get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Crame. I'm a staff attorney with the Sierra Club Environmental Law Program. I'm going to speak briefly about why we commissioned this report on the costs and benefits of offshore wind in New England. New England is currently experiencing rising electricity and natural gas prices, primarily because of the region's heavy reliance on natural gas as a fuel for both power generation and home heating. Offshore wind provides an abundant alternative to natural gas for power generation in New England. Opponents of offshore wind often argue that building out offshore wind infrastructure is too expensive, often without any empirical support for that contention. And recent increases in the cost of offshore wind and the cancellation of contracts for development of offshore wind have further raised questions about the costs and benefits of the renewable resource. So Sierra Club commissioned Synapse to study the effect that building out offshore wind would have on electric customers' bills, on climate emissions, and on public health, using actual current offshore wind contract prices and levels of offshore wind deployment consistent with the targets set by New England states. As New England moves forward with offshore wind procurements, we hope these results can give decision makers confidence in the benefits of offshore wind. And now I'll turn it over to Melissa Whited, who will discuss what Synapse's report found.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I have a slide deck that I'll share. All right, great. So I'm really excited to be sharing the results of our study that we prepared for Sierra Club with you today on the benefits of offshore wind in New England. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Melissa Whited, and I'm a vice president at Synapse Energy Economics. We're located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we were founded in 1996. We work for public interest and government clients, analyzing the electric and gas sectors. And we have about a staff of 40 experts on energy, economic, and environmental topics. So as Sarah mentioned, we know that New England is really heavily reliant on natural gas for power generation and home heating. And natural gas prices are extremely volatile, which causes our electricity bills to spike, as well as impacts our natural gas bills for heating as well. So the New England states collectively are targeting 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So Sierra Club wanted Synapse to look at what adding 9 gigawatts to the grid would do in terms of customer bills, reductions in natural gas spending, avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, and public health impacts. So I'll be walking through those results. The key findings of our analysis are that adding 9 gigawatts of offshore wind will benefit customers and reduce New England electricity bills for the average residential customer by almost $3 a month under a mid-case natural gas price scenario. It rises to almost $5 per month under a high natural gas price scenario. At the same time, it'll significantly reduce the region's emissions, reducing carbon emissions on the electricity grid by 42% relative to today's levels. It'll also have the amount of money that we send out of the region each year for natural gas for power generation. And it'll provide $362 million in public health benefits by reducing NOx, SO2, and PM2.5 emissions each year. And finally, it'll improve our energy security by reducing our reliance on natural gas, which often gets constrained when the pipelines are at maximum capacity during the winter. So first, I'll talk about the electricity bill savings for customers, because that, of course, is very exciting, especially when there's so many questions about the cost of wind and how it'll really impact the day-to-day customer. So our approach was to model the impacts on the wholesale market by adding 9 gigawatts to the supply stack. And the supply stack just organizes the generators in order of their marginal cost to generate. And then we conducted a regression analysis using 23 years of historical weather data to capture the range of electricity prices under different weather scenarios, and natural gas prices and demand. And then we accounted for the cost of the offshore wind by looking at recent contract prices in both New York and existing contracts in New England with Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind. So first, to level set about how the wholesale market for electricity works. There's a supply curve and a demand curve, and where they intersect sets the price in the wholesale market. And the price that we pay, that all customers in New England pay, is directly linked to the wholesale market clearing prices. There may be a little bit of a delay or a lag in when those prices are reflected due to bids being placed for, say, 6-month chunks of energy that we purchase at a time. But eventually, the prices in the wholesale market translate into real costs that customers face in their bills. So that market clearing price is set by where the demand and supply curves meet. And as I mentioned before, the supply curve organizes each generator in terms of the cost that that generator has to produce electricity. And that's based on the bid price that that generator bids into the market. So most of the time in New England, this is a natural gas power plant that's on the margin, that's setting that market clearing price. And the natural gas power plant has to bid into the market a price that's high enough to cover its fuel costs, because that's the main cost that a natural gas generator has when it's producing a little bit extra electricity. So then the market clearing price is highly dependent on the price of natural gas fuel for electricity generation. This graph here shows a stylized supply curve in blue and demand curve in pink. And when you add a renewable resource that has low operating costs, because it has no fuel cost to cover, you add it to the very beginning of the supply stack because it bids in at near zero into the wholesale market. And that shifts out the entire supply stack. So now you have a new supply curve as this dark blue line. And this orange part here represents adding 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind to the supply stack at a near zero price. And what happens when you shift out that supply stack is that now the demand curve and the supply curve intersect at a lower point on the supply stack. So a lower cost generator is now setting the market clearing price. And when that market clearing price falls, all of the electricity sold in New England pays that new lower, or is charged that new lower price. And so all of the electricity now is at a lower price, which results in real savings for customers. It's not just the quantity of offshore wind that then gets that new lower price. It's all of the electricity. And offshore wind tends to have the highest capacity factors. That means it generates the most during the winter months when natural gas tends to be most constrained because we're using it also for heating. So this graph shows the range of capacity factors for offshore wind over the weather years 2000 to 2022. Those are the blue bars for each month. And the diamond in each month is the average capacity factor for that month. So we're seeing capacity factors around 60% in the winter months when supply of natural gas is most constrained and we have some of the highest market clearing prices. And also, offshore wind has a complementary generation profile to solar resources. Solar resources, of course, tend to generate the most in the middle of the day when the sun is shining. So that's these dotted lines in the summer in yellow and the winter in blue. Offshore wind tends to have its highest generation in the morning, overnight hours, and in the late evening hours. So offshore wind declines a bit in the middle of the day, and that's when solar generation picks up. So there's a very complementary load profile there, or generation profile, that makes offshore wind even more valuable when, excuse me, when we're using solar as well. So as I mentioned, we use a regression analysis, which takes a lot of historical data and looks at the relationship between natural gas prices, electricity demand, and then the wholesale electricity prices. And it creates a formula that can explain that relationship. And using that, we then modeled what we expected the prices would be in 2030 once we add 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. And again, we modeled that by shifting out the supply curve to accommodate the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. So for the 23 weather years that we modeled, we see that the wholesale electricity market prices plummet from 45% to 60% on average. In addition, we have the benefit of offshore wind avoiding the need to buy additional renewable energy certificates. So the decline in market clearing prices provides a benefit to all customers through the electricity prices in New England, plus the avoided renewable energy certificate purchases. And then we have to add in the cost of the offshore wind contracts themselves. Those contract prices have recently been at about $150 per megawatt hour in New York. And we took that $150 per megawatt hour and assumed all additional offshore wind procured through 2030 would be at those higher prices. We also added in the existing prices for Vineyard Wind and Revolution Wind, which are in the range of $80 to $95 per megawatt hour. And these contract prices include the full cost of constructing those projects and bringing that electricity to the grid. And it's important to remember, too, that customers do not pay the contract prices until the offshore wind is actually generating electricity. And when the offshore wind starts generating electricity and customers start paying for it, it also starts impacting the wholesale market prices and reducing those market prices, which produces the benefit for everyone. So the costs and benefits, the timing of those costs and benefits are very well aligned. So we had the benefits on one hand and the costs on the other. We brought them together to see what the net impact would be for customer bills. And that's where we found that there would be a savings for the region to the tune of $630 million annually under a mid-case natural gas price. If we had a high natural gas price, those savings would increase to $1 billion annually. So again, for the average residential customer, this equates to savings of nearly $3 per month under a mid-case natural gas price, or $4.61 under a high natural gas price case. We then looked at how natural gas is linked to electricity price volatility in New England. And we see here that the blue line is the price of natural gas, and the green line, the price of electricity in the wholesale market, follows it very closely. And so this illustrates that phenomenon that I was talking about earlier, where natural gas tends to set the market clearing price. And so the price of electricity fluctuates very closely as natural gas prices fluctuate. So this price volatility leads to volatility in customer electricity bills and in the gas bills that we're paying for heating costs. And when the prices spike, so too does the amount of money that the region sends out of the region each year just to buy that natural gas for power generation. Each year, New England sends out over $3 billion for natural gas on average, and sometimes much more. So adding 9 gigawatts of offshore wind would reduce that by more than half, keeping $1.57 billion on average in the region each year. In addition to those economic benefits, we have emissions and public health benefits. The electricity provided by offshore wind is enough to completely offset the amount of natural gas equal to that burned by all the power plants in Connecticut and Massachusetts in an average year. So that's a lot of natural gas that we're avoiding combusting. And as we avoid combusting that fossil fuel, we're avoiding a lot of carbon emissions into the air. So we estimate that we would reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 14 million short tons each year. And that would reduce the emissions of the power grid by 42% relative to today's emissions. If we value those reduced carbon emissions at the social cost of carbon using a 2% discount rate, that's a savings of $3.5 billion. And those savings are real savings, but we don't factor them into our analysis of rate and bill impacts. So this is additional savings that we're getting from avoiding those carbon emissions, avoiding the carbon damages that would occur from those carbon emissions. And on top of that, we have avoided nitrogen oxides, avoided SO2, sulfur dioxide, and avoided particulate matter. And those that type of pollution causes health impacts, and the avoided mortality and morbidity from those emissions equals to benefits in public health of $362 million per year. Those benefits are also not factored into the economic analysis on customer rates and bills. And here are some resources. When the slides are available, you can access the report and the press release here. And now I'll turn it over to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Right. Okay. All right. And just. All right. And confirming that my screen is shared.
All set.
Great. All right. Well, I just wanted to thank you, Tricia, and the Nature Conservancy for producing this series. And really a thank you to everyone that's tuning in today. These are very technical topics, but we really do think it's important when we're thinking about the value of offshore wind, because the benefits that we're looking at are real benefits, and they really speak to the value of offshore wind in addition to its climate benefits. So with that, I'm going to start with a very high level view just to make sure everyone's on the same page and to put our study into context. And also to make the point that things are really happening on two different levels with offshore wind. So we know there's a lot of activity at the state level with procurements and targets. And we also know that all of that energy from offshore wind projects is going to be delivered to the power grid. But here it's really important to point out that the power grid is not run by states. It's a different actor, the ISO New England, as Trish mentioned, the independent system operator of New England. And part of the problem with the grid is that it's so complex that it can really seem like a black box, or in this case, a gray box. But it's actually really important to understand what is happening at the grid level, because we're seeing several different benefits distinct from the climate benefits. And they really need to be included when we're thinking about the costs and benefits of offshore wind. So again, this is a huge oversimplification, but the benefits are showing up in different dimensions of the grid. So the study that Melissa just presented, of course, showed very valuable benefits in terms of non-carbon emissions and also in wholesale markets. And our study looked at a different dimension of the grid. We looked at reliability, and we focused specifically on the risk of winter blackouts. And the reason we did that, many people are very familiar with this issue, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, the reason we looked at winter risk is because this is the biggest reliability risk for the New England grid. And there's been a lot of data that suggests that offshore wind could make a difference, which I will discuss in a minute, but I just wanted to provide a bit more background on this risk. So a blackout is really just an extreme version of an energy shortfall, which the name spells it out. It's really any time on the grid that the amount of energy on the system, it falls short of the energy that is needed. And this can happen any time of year, but in New England, it's most likely to happen in the winter. And that's a little bit counterintuitive, of course, because the summer demand levels are much higher. We've saw very high levels this past week with the heat wave. But we are much more likely to have a shortfall in the winter. So there are two reasons for that, and just wanted to make sure that everyone has these two drivers in mind. So the first driver is that demand still does go up in the winter. When cold weather moves in, we see some very significant increases. This is an example from the cold snap of December 2017 into 2018. And we can see a 21% increase right when the cold weather moved in. And so that's what's happening on the demand side. We do see an increase, but the real problem is on the supply side. So I think many people are aware of this, but again, just for level setting, it's absolutely true that a lot of our gas power plants have trouble accessing fuel when cold snaps occur. And the ISO over the years has started to quantify what that really means in terms of the supply that can be counted on. And you can see this is from the most recent winter outlook. Really, over 4,000 megawatts of gas-fired generation are considered at risk, which means they may not be able to access fuel. And so we really can't count on them during these cold snaps, which is, of course, some of the most critical times for the grid. So that is a problem with the gas fleet. We typically then turn to our oil-fired power plants, but they have different problems, which also mean that they can't necessarily come through in a long duration cold snap. So this is an example going back to that 2017, 2018 cold snap. And the green line is a picture of oil inventories at the end of the 2-week period of cold weather. And you can see that even though we started with a pretty good sized oil fleet of about 12,000 megawatts, after those 2 weeks when the plants were running pretty steadily, really more than 2/3 of the fleet had less than 3 days of fuel left. So again, substantial problems on the supply side when we think about oil and gas generation in a cold snap. And this particular cold snap was such a close call that the ISO began to really actively look for solutions to manage this risk. So that process is still ongoing. There is a regional energy shortfall threshold project ongoing at the ISO, and that's part of the longer term solution. But in the meantime, we have had 2 short-term solutions which really focus on augmenting the oil and gas supplies to get through the winters in the short term. And as you can see, these short-term programs have been extraordinarily expensive. And all of these costs are passed through to ratepayers. So the first of these programs is the Mystic Cost of Service Agreement. And you can see the $755 million in payments. That's been extraordinary. But what's less well known is what the actual price was when you think about it from the point of view of a customer. So customers only received a limited amount of energy from Mystic. And when you divide the payment by the amount of energy that they received, you see these very high unit prices. The same thing is true of the inventoried energy program. We just finished the first winter of that program. Again, a high lump sum or high total cost of payments to oil and gas generators. And then again, when we look at it from the point of view of a customer, we only had 1 day in this past winter when these units in the IEP program really provided energy. And if you, even using a very conservative assumption, if you divide the payment under the IEP program by the most generous interpretation of the amount of energy that was provided, you still end up with these really high per unit costs. So these are the short-term measures for managing energy shortfall risk. They're incredibly expensive, but luckily for ratepayers, they are ending. And I mentioned that the ISO is looking now at longer-term solutions. and that there's been a lot of data suggesting offshore wind can play a role. These are the studies I was referring to. You can see they look very closely at how offshore wind will perform during cold snaps. And the charts on the right show, of course, it's a variable resource, so the output will fluctuate. But if you look at the area under the curve in each of these charts, you can see that over the duration of a cold snap, offshore wind really provides an enormous amount of energy. And it's very valuable energy because of the time period that it's being delivered. So the last study here, this 2023 study that the ISO did with EPRI, is really the gold standard. If anyone's interested in diving further into these technical details, that's the place to look. It's a very sophisticated and innovative approach to model energy shortfall risk. And offshore wind does show up in the study as making a significant difference. But it's hard to see offshore wind in isolation because this is such a comprehensive study. So we set out to do something a little simpler where it would be easier to look at offshore wind in isolation. And we just ask this very simple question, which is, can offshore wind measurably reduce energy shortfall risk? And again, it's a complex subject, so it's difficult to really measure it. So we looked around for different metrics, and we ended up taking a page literally from the ISO. This is from page 3 of the ISO's energy assessment forecast. And you can see it measures one of the important risk factors for an energy shortfall, which is daily energy demand. So that's demand over a 24-hour period. And you can see it assigns different risk levels in these 50,000 megawatt hour increments. And the most important thing to take away from this slide is that anything over 350,000 megawatt hours of daily energy demand does put the region at an elevated risk of a shortfall in the winter season. So we use this metric, and then we actually use the same data set that Synapse used, this really excellent historical set of meteorological data and load data. And we were able to look at what this risk factor looked like over the 22 winters covered by the data series. And this is just one example. This is the winter of 2014, 2015. You can see it was an extraordinarily cold winter, and the region was really at an elevated risk of a shortfall, pretty much for the entire season. I think this was 70 days above this 350,000 megawatt hour mark, and 11 days above the higher threshold of 400,000 megawatt hours. So those periods in the orange band there would have been times that we were burning through the stored oil inventory and stored LNG inventory, which really would have brought the region closer to a shortfall risk. So the same data set has historical offshore wind speed data, and the ISO has developed estimates of how much output you could expect for each of these time periods. So the next 3 slides will show the what demand would have been net of the output from various sizes of offshore wind fleets. So net demand is a very common measure to use when you're trying to understand the impact of a renewable resource, because as Melissa mentioned, it's a zero marginal cost or low marginal cost fuel or marginal cost resource. So it will be dispatched early in the supply stack. So we know that that after we can subtract the energy from offshore wind, and we'll get a good picture of what the demand levels would look like and what the rest of the system would need to meet. So the first this first slide shows an offshore wind fleet of 1,500 megawatts, which is essentially what we'll have when we look at Vineyard Wind and Revolution Wind, their combined capacities. And you can see it actually would have made a very big difference in this winter if they'd been running. It would remove the risk or lower the risk level to below that higher threshold on every day except for one at the end of February. And it also would have moved the region out of the yellow zone on several days. But there is still a good amount of elevated risk. So then we looked at what would happen if we added a few more projects to bring the offshore wind fleet to about 4,000 megawatts. And you can see here a very significant difference. The difference between these two lines, that space represents all the energy that a 4,000 megawatt fleet would have delivered. And you can see that the risk level is dramatically lowered. And then looking at an 8,000 megawatt fleet, virtually every day except for one in February, that the elevated risk from demand would essentially have been canceled out by the energy that an 8,000 megawatt fleet would have delivered. So this was, we didn't expect to find the results this significant, but we did, and we found it pretty consistently across all 22 winter seasons. Here's the overview with all of those years represented. And you can see that even Vineyard Wind and Revolution Wind would have made a substantial difference. They would have cut the number of days with elevated risk almost in half. And then again, adding just a few more projects to get the fleet to a 4,000 megawatt level would significantly lower the risk. And then 8,000 megawatts would actually be enough to offset the kind of demand increases that we've been seeing over the past 22 winters. Now, of course, we know, and the ISO is projecting, that winter demand is going to go up substantially in coming years with heating electrification. So we would certainly need more than 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind as winter demand starts to go up. But what the surprising finding here was that 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind would be enough to really eliminate this type of demand-driven risk. So that is, those are the highlights of the study. And I just wanted to wrap up with sort of the most important takeaway is that the offshore wind, just because of the way it works, its characteristics make it very valuable to handle this risk because unlike oil and gas, the supply of offshore wind energy goes up just during these critical periods when we have high demand from cold weather. And we know that Vineyard and Revolution Wind are going to make a difference, but it's really good to know that even a few more projects bringing the fleet to 4,000 megawatts could go a long way to managing the risk, and that it's also within reach to really offset this the demand-driven risk factor if we were to have an offshore wind fleet of 8,000 megawatts. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that the cost of not procuring more offshore wind is not zero. We will not have the Mystic in the IEP programs, but we will likely have something that is similar because without offshore wind, we really will need to fall back on oil and gas solutions. And it's just very difficult to see how those solutions could be at a much lower cost because they're still facing the same constraints that the oil and gas fleets are today that we mentioned. So with that, I will close and wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. What I took away from your presentations is that to protect against potential energy shortfalls in the winter, New England has to subsidize oil and gas every year to secure that backup fuel. And I heard that over the past 2 years, that's cost New England ratepayers hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't think these are costs we usually think about. And I also heard that New England has no sources of fossil fuel to call its own. So we're really relying on an often volatile global market for oil and gas to keep us warm in the winter. So offshore wind is not only a secure energy resource right in our own backyard, but the supply of that actually increases during the winter when we need it. At least those were takeaways I have, but I have a couple of questions before we get to Q&A, and I'll just remind folks to drop your questions in Q&A if you have them, and also to look at the answered column if you've submitted a question, because there are a few written answers that have been provided. Susan, I guess the thing that I'm curious about is your report says that New England has no sources of fossil fuel to call its own. So why isn't the answer then to just build more gas pipelines?
Thank you. That's a question that comes up. The short answer would be that building more gas pipelines would directly undercut the climate goals of most of the New England states. So any solution that looks at building more fossil fuel infrastructure should be treated with a lot of skepticism. You also have to think about the burden that would impose on the communities that new pipelines would go through. Certainly from their perspective, it's not going to be a good solution. And then the last point most relevant to our study is that when you look at who's suggesting that building more pipelines would be a better solution, we're not seeing the ISO suggest that anymore. The ISO previously said that, but it really started saying, really delivering a different message after it looked at the details and saw how much energy offshore wind can provide. And so the ISO that most recently delivered this message to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at Winter New England Reliability Forum last June. The ISO is saying that based on this data, if we deliver offshore wind, if we develop offshore wind in time, that will manage this energy shortfall risk. And as long as that happens, we won't need to turn to fossil fuel infrastructure.
Hi, I'm not muted. I think, am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, okay, great. I'm getting like weird signals in my end. So the other question I have, this one's for Melissa, because this is wonky stuff, and I'm kind of confused. Wondering if you can explain this. And we did get a couple of questions about this, but like, first of all, when we're talking about the offshore wind contract being like $150 per megawatt hour, does that include the cost of construction? And then can you talk a little bit about the clearing price? So this concept of how can an offshore wind contract be expensive, like $150 a megawatt hour, but and lower the clearing price? And I guess I just don't understand that concept. I think you were talking about like how they bid zero into the grid, but like the contract is 150 megawatts an hour, which seems expensive. So wondering if you can just tease that out a little for us.
Sure. So to begin with, the contract price of $150 per megawatt hour, that includes the cost of constructing the offshore wind facility and getting the energy to the grid. For example, some offshore wind farms are interconnecting at the site of former coal plants. And so they're delivering their energy to, a major grid infrastructure right there that then comes to Boston, comes to Connecticut, comes to the major load centers of New England. And so what we're paying for is the energy that's then delivered to the grid. So it includes all the construction costs, all the financing costs. And those costs are, shouldered by the wind developers. And then they get paid when the wind farm is actually generating energy. So when that wind energy comes onto the grid, then they're getting paid $150 per megawatt hour, and that's sort of like a price assurance there. But then they sell into the wholesale market and they offer in at a price of close to $0 per megawatt hour. That ensures that they're dispatched, that the system operator dispatches them and says, yes, generate, and we will pay you whatever the market clearing price is. And so by doing that and getting paid the market clearing price, you are obviating the need for more expensive generators to generate. And so because you have all this really low cost offshore wind coming onto the grid, those really high cost natural gas peaker plants or oil fired peaker plants don't have to generate, don't have to be dispatched. And that reduces the point at which the supply and demand curves intersect, which reduces the market clearing price for all electricity purchased in the market. And I should also say that the $150 per megawatt hour that we're paying, we don't have to actually then turn around and then pay that generator again in the market. The $150 per megawatt hour is actually reduced by whatever price the offshore wind farm actually gets in the market. So we're paying the net there. And we're paying that for this relatively small quantity of offshore wind. We're paying a higher price, but because it's lowering the price in the wholesale market for all energy purchased in the wholesale market, which is 3 to 4 times the amount of offshore wind that we have, that produces a benefit that outweighs the cost of the offshore wind contracts. So really it is a little bit of, a complex system here, but it does produce valuable impacts, valuable benefits in the wholesale market, which then, even when netting out the price of the offshore wind contracts, produces savings of millions of dollars, hundreds of $1 million per year.
Great. That's helpful. I'm going to go to some of the Q&A that we have from some of our audience. So we have one question about, like, it seems like we're looking at only energy costs. Shouldn't we include market capacity and transmission costs, which will increase for offshore wind? That's general.
Yeah,
Anybody can take a stab at that.
I think that the impacts on the capacity market are a little unclear, because there can be some benefits in the capacity market and some additional costs. And so, we didn't model the specific impacts. They probably net out to something close to zero. The transmission costs, there may be some transmission upgrades needed, but a planned approach to transmission will minimize those costs. Like I was talking about, wind farms delivering energy at the site of old coal plants, like Brayton Point, for example. We're just reusing existing infrastructure there. So any additional transmission costs in the near term are going to be fairly minimal compared to the benefits provided by offshore wind. For example, I think I read that Vineyard Wind had $200 million in transmission costs. It's a one-time transmission upgrade that we have to do for $200 million. Meanwhile, our modeling is that the benefits to New England ratepayers exceed $600 million each year under a mid-case natural gas price scenario, and $1.7 billion annually under a high natural gas price scenario. So when you put it in perspective, sure, there are some incremental transmission costs that we would expect, but if we take a planned approach, if we utilize the existing infrastructure, those costs should not be very high, especially because offshore wind has the benefit of being generally sited close to load centers. Much of the New England's load is along the coast. That's also true of New Jersey, New York. So that's very close to where the offshore wind will be. And so we don't need a lot of grid upgrades to get that load or that energy to load centers.
That's great. Thank you.
And Trish, I could add a little more to that.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to also point out that the ISO is actually in the middle of redesigning the capacity market with the capacity accreditation approach. And they are looking more closely at the timing of when energy is delivered. And so we actually are going to start to see capacity prices reflect the higher value of offshore wind. And conversely, we will see the lower value of the gas resources that are constrained. It's another complex topic, but these redesigns will actually start to reflect that value in capacity prices too.
Makes sense. There's a question here about, we heard on the presentation from the Synapse report in particular, about the costs associated with, or the benefits associated with public health. Where are the costs to wildlife and ecosystems? Are they factored into this report? Should we be considering those costs? So, to nitrogen loading in ponds and those types of things, those costs associated with fossil fuel versus offshore wind reflected in the cost analysis.
Yeah, I'll just say that, I think that that's a topic that's going to be addressed later in this webinar series. We did not look at specific costs to the ecosystems of offshore wind.
But there is cost, and I guess we will be looking at how, in particular, how climate change is impacting fish, birds, marine mammals, and communities in the upcoming webinar series over the course of the next 6 months, in addition to kind of how we're monitoring for impacts to wildlife and ecosystems and interactions with offshore wind development and mitigating those impacts. So that will be something that we attempt to address in some of the sessions that are coming up. Wonder if either of you have could kind of give just because again, these are really complicated and there seem like there are a lot of players. If one or both of you could kind of give just a snapshot of what ISO New England is and how it works with the states in terms of, buying energy. So we have like states buying energy from offshore wind companies. We have ISO New England making decisions about what goes into the stack, like for certain periods of time. It seems like there's a lot of disconnect, and maybe even federal agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission making rulings or decisions that impact all of this. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of give a little clarity on the roles.
I can take a stab at that, just very generally. And you're right, it is it is easy to be confused. The general answer is that there does not necessarily need to be a state role in the resources on the grid, but individual states have decided, based on their statutory climate policies, that they do want to be encouraging carbon-free energy. So that the state involvement starts with when a state has a climate policy that says we want to see this carbon-free energy on the power grid. And then, as I mentioned, the ISO is actually the operator of the grid. So it has said very clearly that it will accommodate any energy that states would like to add to the grid, but it's officially neutral. And so the bulk of the energy that we see is really just coming from it's a deregulated marketplace. So individual private entities are building various forms of generation and selling into this market. So the offshore wind and other, they call them state-sponsored resources, are participating in those markets, but with that state support. So it's a bit of a hybrid. But then, as I said, the ISO, in thinking about the value and the reliability of different types of resources, has started to talk clearly about the value that it sees from offshore wind in particular, regardless of the reason that it's being built. That value is showing up in its reliability studies.
That's great. That's helpful. All right, this is kind of a tricky question. We're going to end with this, and it's a good question, and I don't know if you know the answer, but one of the questions we received is, can you comment on the degree to which the cited benefits have accrued to foreign markets where large-scale offshore wind power has already been built and is operational? And I don't know if you have an answer to that question, and we can certainly dig into it or follow up, but maybe if you could guide me into how we would sort of figure that out if we were curious about it.
Again, I can take a general stab. I'd say that this really interesting question. I can say that the way to think about it would be, again, looking at the customer's point of view. So individual electric customers, as Melissa mentioned, are really feeling the impacts of all of these different energy resources. And so regardless of where the money is going from the customer's point of view, they're getting a better value from offshore wind than, for example, oil and gas for winter reliability. But I think it's also the case, and others can speak to this probably better, that an enormous amount of value from these projects is going to stay in the region. We see massive amounts of economic development in every state that is hosting offshore wind, massive benefits for the workforce, the public health benefits. So virtually all of those are going to be right within the region.
And I'll just point out for Europe, for example, that has been a leader in offshore wind development. They've certainly reaped the benefits as the price of gas has skyrocketed due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They see higher gas prices, and so the benefits for them have certainly paid off, I would say. Offshore wind is even more valuable.
Excellent. I just want to thank you both. We're approaching the end of our time today. I want to thank Melissa, Sarah, and Susan for these excellent presentations on a topic that is not easy to present on or talk about, but really important to continue these conversations. So thank you so much. And we want to thank all of you for joining us today. And thank you again to all of you who support the Nature Conservancy so generously. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with a link to a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying our webinars, please be sure to share them with your friends and colleagues. You can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. As always, you can register for future webinars at nature.org/MA webinars. TNC is working on offshore wind because we believe it is absolutely critical to mitigating climate change, that all of our conservation efforts require us to mitigate climate change, and that with good science, we can find the best ways to build offshore wind to maximize the benefits it can deliver to people and to nature. But we also know it's complicated and that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. During our next webinar in this series, which will take place on August 22nd at noon Eastern Standard Time, we'll be talking about the federal siting process for offshore wind. We will hear from Dr. Seth Tharakoff, a renewable energy program specialist with the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who explain the approach that the federal government uses to identify wind energy areas in the ocean that are suitable for offshore wind leasing. We hope you can join us then. Thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.